In August 1944, every serious military analyst in London and Washington was working from the same assumption. The war in Europe would be over before Christmas. The reasoning was not optimism, it was math. The German army in France had just been destroyed. The Falaise Pocket alone had killed about 10,000 Germans and captured another 40 to 50,000. Across the broader Normandy campaign, total German prisoners had passed 200,000. The Wehrmacht had abandoned its heavy equipment across 200 miles of road and was running east on foot. Paris had been liberated on August 25th. Brussels fell on September 3rd. Antwerp on September 4th. And American spearheads were crossing into Germany itself by the second week of September. The British Joint Intelligence Committee, looking at all of it, concluded that for planning purposes, organized German resistance in the West would collapse by the end of December. They were wrong by 5 months. In those months, 300,000 more Americans would become casualties. 33,000 of them in a single battle in a forest most Americans have never heard of. The Wehrmacht, which had been a broken army in September, would launch the largest offensive on the Western Front since 1940. The question is, how? The Falaise Pocket in mid-August was not a normal defeat. It was an annihilation. The German 7th Army had been smashed. The 5th Panzer Army was a name attached to fragments. Some German divisions that had numbered 12,000 men at the start of the summer reached the frontier with only a few hundred combat-effective infantry left. For 2 months before the breakout, the British and Canadians had been grinding through the bocage south of Caen against the bulk of German armour in Normandy. 6 panzer divisions, including most of the SS armour, concentrated against the eastern sector, while the American front faced roughly 1.5. When Operation Cobra broke open the American sector in late July, it broke open against the panzer divisions the British and Canadians had spent 10 weeks bleeding white. The pursuit across France was a pursuit through a hole the Anglo-Canadian forces had punched. The math is documented in the German divisional records. What's contested is whether Montgomery designed it that way or claimed credit after the fact. The retreat across France was not a fighting withdrawal. It frequently devolved into a rout. American and British commanders saw what they were looking at and concluded the war was almost over. Patton's Third Army was advancing 30 miles a day. The British 21st Army Group was through Belgium in 11 days. The Germans were not stopping anywhere. They were running for the West Wall, the old defensive line on the German frontier that had been built before the war. And Allied intelligence assessments were that the West Wall could not hold. The numbers supported the assessment. In early September, Allied forces in the West outnumbered Germans by roughly 2 to 1 in combat troops. In tanks, the ratio was closer to 3 to 1. In aircraft, it was 4 to 1, and over the front itself, sometimes much higher. What those ratios miss is the kind of advantage they describe. The German army running east in September was outnumbered, but the men who survived the rout were the men who had survived 4 years of the Eastern Front. The Wehrmacht's institutional depth was real, even when its present strength was catastrophic. Every general on the Allied side knew that an outnumbered German force given time to dig in had historically been one of the most dangerous defensive opponents of the modern era. And then the advance stopped. The Allied armies ran out of gas. By September 1944, the Allied supply chain in Europe was strangling itself. Almost every ton of fuel, food and ammunition still had to be landed at Normandy and trucked east, because the Channel ports the Allies needed were either still held by German garrisons or had been deliberately wrecked. Antwerp, the largest port in Western Europe and the only one that could realistically supply the advance, had been captured intact on September 4th. It would not be operational until the end of November. The reason was geographic. Antwerp sits 60 miles inland up the Scheldt estuary. To use the port, the Allies needed to clear German forces from both banks of that estuary. Montgomery's 21st Army Group, which had taken Antwerp, did not move to clear the Scheldt for almost a month. He had his eyes on Arnhem and the Rhine instead. What that delay cost the Allies was an army. The German 15th Army had been trapped against the coast by the Allied sweep through Belgium. General of Infantry Gustav Adolf von Zangen had no land route out. What he had was the Scheldt estuary at his back and a few weeks of Allied inattention. Using ferries, barges and civilian fishing boats, the 15th Army evacuated roughly 90,000 men, 600 artillery pieces and thousands of vehicles across the water to Walcheren Island and South Beveland. Within weeks, those men were manning the defensive lines that would block any Allied advance towards the Rhine for the next 3 months. When the operation to clear the Scheldt finally began in early October, those evacuated divisions were dug into flooded mined terrain that the troops grimly nicknamed the Coffin. The battle would last until November 8th and cost the 1st Canadian Army, a multinational force of Canadian, British and Polish troops, nearly 13,000 casualties. The Canadians, who had spent the summer grinding through the worst of the bocage, were now handed the worst of the autumn, fighting alongside British and Polish divisions who bled just as heavily in the flooded terrain. For 10 weeks, at the critical moment of the war, the largest port in Western Europe sat unused while Allied divisions 150 miles further east ran on the fumes of trucks driving from the Normandy beaches. By late September, Patton's Third Army was rationed to a fraction of its fuel requirement. American tank divisions in front of the West Wall were sitting idle not because the Germans were stopping them, but because they had nothing to move with. Artillery shells were rationed alongside fuel. The American official history records the period bluntly. The advance halted not from enemy action, but from logistical exhaustion. The Germans had 10 weeks to rebuild a front that should not have existed. There was a debate within the Allied High Command about how to avoid the supply crisis. Eisenhower's plan called for a broad front advance, all Allied armies moving forward together along the entire length of the Western Front. The advantage was that no army would be exposed. The disadvantage was that every army needed supply, and the supply system could not sustain all of them at once. Montgomery proposed an alternative: concentrate the available fuel and ammunition behind a single thrust, his own 21st Army Group, pushing through the Netherlands and across the Rhine into the industrial heart of Germany. Patton proposed a parallel version: concentrate the supply behind Third Army and drive into the Saar. The cases for both narrow thrust options were the same. The Germans were broken. The window was short. A single concentrated push had a real chance of finishing the war before winter. A broad front advance had little chance of finishing the war at all. Eisenhower chose broad front. The reasons were both logistical and political. The logistical case, which modern historians like Roland Ruppenthal have argued is the decisive one, was that even a concentrated thrust could not be supplied deep into Germany without a functioning forward port, and Antwerp was still unusable. The political case was that he was running a coalition. Favouring Montgomery would have produced an American revolt. Favouring Patton would have produced a British one. Whichever case mattered more, the broad front was the answer he gave. It was also the answer that gave Germany the winter. Montgomery, given the broad front decision, tried to force a single thrust anyway. The result was Operation Market Garden, the airborne assault on Arnhem in mid-September that has become one of the most famous Allied failures of the war. It came within a few miles of working. The Germans destroyed the airborne forces at Arnhem and the corridor collapsed. After Arnhem, there were no more attempts to finish the war by Christmas. The remainder of 1944 became a grinding frontal slog along the entire Western Front, fought through autumn rain in terrain the Germans had now had 2 months to prepare. Most Americans who know about the European War know Normandy and the Bulge. Between September and December of 1944, the American First Army fought a battle in the Hurtgen Forest along the German-Belgian border that produced more American casualties than any battle on the Western Front before the Bulge that followed it. 33,000 Americans dead, wounded, or missing in 3 months of fighting in dense pine forest. The forest is 50 square miles. It took the Americans 90 days to take it. By the end, divisions were being broken on it and rebuilt and broken again. The mechanism that made the Hurtgen so lethal was simple and terrible. German artillerymen did not aim for the ground. They set their shells to detonate in the dense canopy overhead, raining steel fragments and jagged wood splinters into the open foxholes below. Ernest Hemingway, who observed the fighting, called it Passchendaele with tree bursts. The reason this battle is forgotten is that it achieved none of its strategic objectives. The objective was the Roer River dams beyond the forest, which the Germans could open to flood any Allied advance toward the Rhine. The Americans did not take the dams. They lost a division equivalent of men trying. The men holding the Hurtgen were not the spring divisions of Normandy. They were newly designated Volksgrenadier units, deliberately restructured formations built around veteran cadres from destroyed divisions, filled out with surplus sailors and airmen, and lavishly equipped with assault rifles and Panzerfausts to maximize short-range firepower with fewer men. By every measure of traditional infantry training, these were second-line units, and they held a forest for 3 months against the most heavily supplied army in the world. If improvised German units could do that against First Army, how broken was the Wehrmacht actually? And how badly had the Allies let themselves be stopped? If you're into history that follows the actual mechanics of how wars end, the supply lines, the political decisions, the forests nobody talks about, this is the channel for you. Now, back to the question. In early September, Field Marshal Walter Model stood on the German side of the West Wall with what was left of Army Group B. He had inherited the worst military situation any German commander had faced in the West since 1918. His 7th Army no longer existed. His 5th Panzer Army was a name attached to fragments. The men in front of him had been retreating for 3 weeks. The men behind him in Germany were 16-year-olds. In 60 days, he would assemble the force that launched the Battle of the Bulge. The German army was a state within a state in a way no Allied army was. It had been the primary institution of German society since Bismarck, a professional culture with the best educated officers, the most disciplined NCOs, and a century of doctrine for how to defend without numerical advantage. Britain and the United States, by contrast, had entered the war with armies designed as frontier police and colonial troops. They had built prime-time war machines from scratch, under fire, in 3 years. The Soviet Union had done something similar after losing most of its officer corps to Stalin's purges. What the Wehrmacht still had in fall 1944 was the institutional core that had taken a century to build. That depth was reinforced from above by something far uglier. After the July 20th assassination attempt on Hitler, the traditional aristocratic military culture was purged. National Socialist leadership officers, modelled on Soviet political commissars, were embedded in frontline units. Flying drumhead courts-martial worked the front in the final months. Hanging soldiers who retreated without orders from lampposts with placards reading, "I am a coward." The German military executed more than 20,000 of its own men during the war for desertion and similar charges. The United States Army executed exactly one. The line held in part because the veteran cadre knew how to fight. It also held because the men leading those soldiers knew what happened to deserters. Model worked the system ruthlessly. He stripped quiet sectors for reserves the moment they were quiet. Interior lines meant he could shift those reserves between fronts faster than the Allies could coordinate pressure. He counted on Allied caution to give him the time to do it. He almost always got the time. There was one more factor: the weather. Through October, November, and December, rain and fog grounded Allied tactical aircraft for weeks at a time. The 4-to-1 advantage in aircraft means nothing when the planes cannot fly. The campaign collapsed into a pure infantry and artillery fight on terrain the Germans had selected in weather that favoured the defender. By December, Germany had assembled 25 divisions for the offensive that would become the Battle of the Bulge. The Bulge is usually remembered as Germany's last gasp. It is more accurately understood as the proof that the line was held. An army with no reserves cannot launch an offensive of 250,000 men. Germany did. It failed strategically. It never came close to its objectives at Antwerp, but it failed only after running for 6 weeks through Allied positions, killing 19,000 Americans and taking the entire Allied command by surprise. The Wehrmacht of December was not the Wehrmacht of August. It was something stranger, a wrecked army that had been given enough time to become dangerous again. The line was held because the Allies handed it back. The Scheldt sat uncleared, the supply chain strangled itself, the narrow thrust got argued away. And the German army still had enough left in its professional core, its internal terror, and its ideological commitment to take what it was given. Each of those decisions, by itself, probably ends the war by Christmas. Together, they made the war run through May of the following year. It was very close. What made the German army hard to beat was also what put Germany in 2 world wars in a generation. So which mattered more, the dysfunction that handed Germany the time, or the institution that knew what to do with it? Drop where you land in the comments. Subscribe if this changed how you think about how the war in the West actually ended. Thanks for watching.